Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are excited to welcome author and attorney Eve Rodsky back to the podcast to discuss, amongst other things, her latest book, Find Your Unicorn Space. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Well, welcome back. Today, we are welcoming back to the podcast Eve Rodsky. Eve is an attorney and author who wrote the book Fair Play, a game-changing solution for when you have too much to do and more life to live, which came out in late 2019. And her latest book, Find Your Unicorn Space, Reclaim Your Creative Life in a Too Busy World, was published in 2021. She also stars in a documentary called Fair Play, and I'm sure there's so much more that you do even in that list.
Well, thanks, Lee, for that.
Absolutely. And we're so excited to have you back on the podcast. The last time we had you, I had just read Fair Play, and I thought it was so important to talk about these issues of managing your life, really, your whole life, whether you have children or don't have children, have a partner, have a roommate, just managing your life. And then I checked out Unicorn Space, which I listened to an audiobook, and I was blown away because I feel like you really took the messaging from Fair Play and took it almost up a level to a personal place. And I think every busy person, especially women, really should listen and think about your messaging. So to get things started, for folks who don't know about your work, could you share a little bit about what you do and what led you to start researching and writing books on this topic?
Thanks, Lee, for having me. I will say that I did not set out to be an expert on the gender division of labor. That was not on my third grade, what do you want to be when you grow up board? And it wasn't what I answered when Elizabeth Warren in our law school orientation asked me what I want to do with my legal career. It did not have anything to do with gender. I'm resolutely Gen X. We were told that we could be anything, we could do anything, that we were going to be graduating from law school at rates that were faster than men. So I had no idea that my gender would affect the assumptions in my household or how people viewed me over time. But, you cut to, I'd say from that 1999 orientation to probably 2011, right? You cut to 10 years, a decade later. And all the things I thought I'd be smashing, these goals of, I wanted to be president of the United States and the senator and the CEO of a company and a Nick City dancer. I think all these goals that I thought I'd be smashing really was sort of a fallacy, because really the only thing I could tell you I was smashing was like peas, for like a toddler.
Right.
I mean, that's sort of the reality of a decade later, where all these dreams, all these hopes and dreams felt so out of reach. And I couldn't believe how did I get there to a place where I felt completely emotionally abandoned by my partner, emotionally and physically abandoned by my workplace and by society, who really told me that if I didn't want to be a parent or a partner or a professional, if I wasn't going to be in those roles, that there was no place for Eve as a human outside of those roles. I didn't know any of that was happening. So I'm sort of like the ghost of Christmas future. I write, or, to normalize what's happening to people in their present. But that's really been my journey. My journey has been a journey of sort of self-exploration, but I don't think my books are self-help. I look at them as mutual aid, understanding the impact of community and connectedness and relational health. That's something I care about. Mental health and physical health are something we're talking about, but I don't see many people talking about the impact of relational health on their careers and on their identity. And that's where my sort of career has evolved to now.
So I wanted to share a story about me from a few years ago that I kept thinking about when I started reading Unicorn Space, especially. So my business partner and I were doing a podcast a few years ago, and we were talking about stress and work-life balance. And she asked me during the podcast, "What are your hobbies?" And I literally had nothing to say because I had one small child. I was pregnant with my second child. And I think I said, spending time with my kids is my hobby. And I remember in that, ouch, right? And so in the moment, I was like, I remember justifying it to myself and saying, like, but this is my phase of life. Like, this is when I just do it all for these kids. Like, my business partner is not a mother. And so she has time to take pottery classes. But like, why would I take pottery classes? Totally. Because I'm in this phase of life. And I think, I kept thinking about this conversation when I got introduced to especially Unicorn Space, because the problem wasn't that I just didn't have a hobby. It wasn't that I just didn't have any interest, but it was really this idea that my time had become this precious commodity. As you talk about, the time is like diamonds, not sand. And Mike, life was just getting exponentially more complicated. But I was just taking it all. I was dropping it all and holding the space. And, then COVID hit. I think we all took that up. Many more levels. I don't even know how to, I feel like any way you describe that time just underrepresents what happened. But so I think my mind was blown by this idea of Unicorn Space, because we've been talking about women in burnout. We've been talking about parents, especially post-pandemic. And I wanted to share with others why it was a bad thing that I didn't have a hobby. And I knew it was a bad thing, but I feel like you helped me hear the language of why it's important to have those outside interests. So what is this Unicorn Space that I'm so excited about? And how should folks go about finding it?
Well, first of all, it's not a bad thing, because society has forced you to be available to everybody else. And as you know from our first time together, that's because women's time, as we said, is considered sand. It's infinite, and men's time is diamonds. So we guard it. And then what happens when you do that is that currency, which is actually our most valuable currency, our time, is given away to others for free before we know it. So I will not say it was a bad thing you didn't have hobbies. It was actually really the only way society wanted you to live. And pushing back to have something for yourself, Lee, as you know, is incredibly subversive. That's why fair play is triggering. Unicorn Space is triggering. These conversations are hard. Because if they were easy, then we would already be doing these things. So I want to say it's not your fault, but I will say that part of the reason is we call these things hobbies in the first place. And when I asked people what they thought about the word hobby, the first thing that it connoted was infrequency. And then you also mentioned another word, burnout. So what Unicorn Space is, it's space for activities that make you come alive, that make you say things like, I can't believe I just did that, as opposed to, I can't believe I just did that. Like binge watching TV or eating my seventh, cinnamon roll that I baked during the pandemic, right back to what you were just talking about. And the beauty of a Unicorn Space, the reason I call it that is not because my daughter Anna likes unicorns. It's because the idea that there could be something mythical and magical that we're missing that doesn't exist until we reclaim it was a very powerful metaphor to me. And that reminded me of a unicorn, that there is this beautiful, mythical, magical being that my daughter keeps asking me, are they real? And I know they're not real, but maybe they become real, right? When we reclaim them. And so that type of space is different from self-care and commodified wellness. And it's different from friendships. Those are like the bottom of the pyramid. And we don't even get those. But now what we're realizing is that you can't wait, as you said, to the top of the pyramid till you're out of this life stage to have Unicorn Space, to have things that light you up, that make you uniquely you. Because we know that when you don't have it, it's really tied to bad health and physical health and mental health outcomes. So it's really not optional to reclaim this Unicorn Space. And we'll sort of talk about how you go about doing that. But I do want to say that your podcast is a great example of a Unicorn Space, right? It has the elements of a unicorn space. It's not just a walk around the block.
Right.
It's not a drink with a friend. It's a way for you, Lee, to stay consistently interested in your own life.
Yeah.
And that's the burnout. That's the antidote to burnout. I wish I could tell you it was a drink with a friend. Really, the only antidote to burnout that I can offer you after researching this now for over a decade is the gift of the consistent interest in your own life.
And creativity. And
yes,
the link, yes.
Typically it's creative pursuits that will make you interested in your own life. And creativity redefined as unicorn space can look many different things. But yes, typically a creative life is one that I define as one that has curiosity, connection, and completion. And that's why I said this podcast, you may not think of it as a creative pursuit because people look at that as sort of browsing Blick for art kits. But why it's important because a creative life, a unicorn space has those aspects of saying, I wonder what it would be like to read this book and to have this author on my show. I have to connect with that author and send out emails and, do the rigor of scheduling that interview. And then you have to complete it, right? You have to get it out in the world and think to yourself, shit, maybe only one person is going to listen to this, but it's still worthwhile for me to edit and upload this episode. Right. Those curiosity, connection, and completion steps are much easier said than done. And that's why I do want you to know that this is, regardless of whether you make $1 or $1 million from this, one of your unicorn spaces is this podcast.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I hadn't framed it that way.
Yes,
thank you.
Yes.
Now I can.
But it is. It
is. I see what you mean. And it is. So I love your point that this isn't self-care, because I think that was one of the interesting things that I found about the book was, I remember I listened to a lot of it while hiking. And I started it and I was saying, look at all what I'm doing for myself. I'm listening to this book about taking better care of myself and being happier while I'm doing this thing that makes me happy. But then it was funny because I remember I'm hiking up the hill behind my house and I hear you say like self-care and taking walks and things like that. It's not what we're talking about. And I was like, uh-oh.
Again, basic fundamental physical health, like movement is like actually what keeps you alive. It's what keeps your kidneys and liver functioning and your cells regenerating. So you need to move, Lee. I'm not telling you not to move.
I know.
But there can be more. And I think that's the beauty. The beauty is, it's a unicorn space when you've shared it with the world.
Yeah.
And why that's important. And I can explain why that's important. And I'll nerd out with you a little bit because I think your listeners can handle the science or the nerding out. But what was interesting about the research, these are two nerd out pieces related to why it's not just self-care. One was it's also not just happiness. There's been 10 years of how to be happy books. And what we're finding now that a lot of the happiness researchers are even saying their work has been misconstrued. Because when you say, I want to be happy or focus on happiness, it actually makes you more sad. Happiness is actually a clue that you're on the right track. It's there's a different place for happiness. So I think that was the problem. One is that we sort of got off on the wrong foot to chase happiness. And when you do that, and then another thing sort of happened, which was people didn't really know what was making them happy or how to use that time because it felt like too much pressure. Well, how do I find a passion? I don't know what I would even do. Like it became like overwhelming to chase whatever this was that made you happy, became even more overwhelming. So first I had to really debunk and understand the true definition of mental health. The true definition of mental health that I talk about in the book at Find Your Unicorn Space is to have an appropriate emotion at appropriate times and have the ability and strength to weather those emotions. My kids now, when they say, I know, you don't want me to be happy. You want me to have the appropriate emotion at the appropriate time and the ability and strength to weather it. That's a true human being. Right. Being happy all the time, we would be sociopaths. So unicorn space is the ability and strength to weather it. It's an umbrella that helps you deal with the reality of life, which is a lot of overwhelm and mundane. And once I could break through and understand, I didn't have to be happy all the time. I could just have unicorn space pursuits that become an umbrella. Then the overwhelm and mundane became part of my experience. And I could have those emotions too. I could have boredom as an emotion. I could have rage as an emotion. I could have resentment as an emotion. They're part of the life cycle. But the unicorn space emotions do something really interesting. They combine happiness and meaning. And that's why the share with the world component is also important. Because what happens is when you elevate it from self-care to a share with the world component, to curiosity, connection, and then completion, you end up doing something that we don't often do. What we often do with our spare time, or what we did during the pandemic, is what is called hedonic pursuits. They're happiness pursuits without meaning. They feel good in the moment. The eating my cinnamon rolls, the binge watching the Netflix, the taking the edibles, the 2 glasses of mommy juice. We've sort of normalized numbing our way through parenting years of having or caregiving years. However, a unicorn space pursuit where you share with the world things that make you come alive, there's a little bit of fear in them. They have curiosity, connection, completion. They combine meaning and happiness. And that's the explosion that I'm looking for people. And that's why I said the way you know you get there is you have a little bit of that, I can't believe I just did that feeling in your life. And that's what we're looking for here.
It's making me think of another book that I just finished, Dopamine Nation.
Yeah,
by
very similar.
Yes, and it's Anna Lemke. I'm not sure if I'm saying her name correctly, but she has. I'm also stalking her for the podcast, so maybe she'll listen to this. I can tag her on it. But what I really work. I do. So, but one of the things she talks about is how if all you're getting are these hits of dopamine, that they are. If your kind of happiness is on this like teeter totter, and if all you're doing is being as happy as you can all the time, getting all this dopamine, and there's no correction by doing anything hard, anything challenging, or any pain, as she calls it, then there's just no way to be happy, because your body's going to be like, I'm going to be anxious. I'm going to be like, I have to find this kind of balance. And I think it's interesting that in your research, this idea of doing something a little hard, like having to kind of make yourself a little uncomfortable, is where some of this the benefit comes. That if it was all just easy, it wouldn't be worth it.
And that's why, again, I wish I could say it was a spin class, or for you to take 4 spin classes wherever you, or hikes do feel good, but they also can feel safe. Leading a hike is unicorn space, right? Baking that pie is unicorn space, and sharing it with a neighbor. There's something really important about the sharing, because that's where people get scared. And like you said, in that fear, there's a lot of growth.
Yeah. Since I was starting to do some of these things, and then also since listening to your book, I have been skiing again.
Yay.
I took up tennis, and I'm working on a foreign language. But the interesting one was tennis, because it made me think of something I used to do a billion years ago when I was younger. But what was interesting is I was thinking about you when I signed up to take lessons, but then I joined a tennis league where I had to play matches, and that's the difference. And it felt very different to say, I'm going to go play this game with someone I don't know. I might lose. I might embarrass myself. I haven't done this in so long. And it had a very different feeling than going to like take a tennis clinic where there's no stakes. There was you didn't have those feelings. But I think that
and by the way, you can start with a lesson. That's the point, right? I mean, that's why I said you don't have to have curiosity, connection, and completion of that game all at once, right? You can start with curiosity. I wonder what it would feel like just to pick up a tennis racket again. But ultimately, my goal is that you get to a place with all three.
Right.
Have the curiosity of picking up a tennis racket, you connect with somebody else to play a match and complete that match, whether or not you win or lose.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm out there. I'm trying it.
What language are you learning?
French, which is a daily practice in the growth mindset. That's what I'll say about that.
Well, can I say something about the daily practice and the growth mindset too, which I love about you? You did something really important just now. So you're a good student of Unicorn Space. You said you were learning a language. You used the verb. And I don't explicitly lay this out in the book, so I will say this to your listeners. There's a lot of beauty in verbs. And so what do I mean by that? I start to see a gender difference in how people reported unicorn space, which I thought was interesting. I didn't see it until the book came out, but it kept happening where women would say to me, well, I'm not a writer. I'm not a dancer. And men would say to me, I'm learning a language. Or I'm playing golf. Men were more willing to live in the verb.
Right.
Whereas women were shutting themselves down as a noun.
Interesting.
And so I want back to the growth mindset. Part of the growth mindset in the Eve Rodsky unicorn space world is to verbify your life. You don't have to be a writer. I will never be a writer. I am somebody who writes as part of my identity in my career. I'm somebody who dances, but I'd rather people live in those verbs than shutting themselves down as I'm not a dancer or I'm not a writer.
So a quote that you use in the beginning of your book by Vivian Green is, life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning how to dance in the rain. And I am so obsessed with this quote. I had never heard it before. I don't know how I had never heard it before. It's now on my office wall. That's how obsessed I am about it. I think that especially during COVID, personally, I felt like I was just living in the storm. And it was like, if we can just get through this next period of time, it really felt like that was the excuse of like, I will do the things that I need to do for myself later. And I think I was cheating my family out of some really cool memories, not just myself, because I had that bit of a mindset. So I love this idea of dancing in the rain. But I also think that life, and especially for those who maybe are having children a little bit later and are having aging parents, we're the sandwich generation, that life, like these storms can be kind of big sometimes.
Very big.
You know, I think, for instance, my husband was called away on a family emergency this week, and then all of a sudden, comes the reshuffle. So what are your thoughts about when you're kind of making these pursuits your priority, but then you come up to these kind of rocky times in life? How do you kind of manage not letting everything go again while things are very stormy?
It's a great question. And I think it gets down to like unicorn space and privilege. If you thought creativity was just for the privileged, right? I mean, then a lot of our population wouldn't have the ability to experience meaning and happiness. And actually, in fact, during more stormy periods, we actually found people more likely to claim unicorn space. So there's a huge amount of research comparatively to other creativity research where there's none around how important creative practices are during periods of death and periods of sickness. And so, and in my research, it did confirm that for me, that women, men, all genders who had a cancer diagnosis, or God forbid, a child die, or a really, really huge tsunami of a storm, felt that the turning to creative practices was the only way to survive.
Interesting.
And so I'm hoping that people know that and can understand that having already a developed unicorn space will help you when even bigger storms come. Because really the truth of the time use studies is that, and I believe it's Natalie Hogan who talks about this, and she has some great books and would be good for the podcast too.
Okay, great. Writing that down.
Yes. She does work in happiness, but again, she's not the sort of, you have to be happy all the time type of happiness researcher, but she talks about how people in time use surveys always think they're going to be less busy in 6 months. And then you ask them, that 6 months comes up and you say, are you less busy? And they're like, hell no, right? I'm more busy. So there's always this sort of bias to believing that things are going to get easier over time. And like you said, if we don't dance in the rain, then there really never will be a time to return ourselves to these pursuits. But I think the way to realize that it's not optional, even during really tough times, is to understand the effects of what these things do to you, right? What these they're called eudaimonic pursuits do for us. What they do for us when we're living in these periods of meaning and happiness, those bursts of unicorn space, they are an umbrella for the overwhelming and mundane. They don't just last. They're not like those cheap hits of dopamine that you get from a video game. They last. And so, those feelings of, I did something hard, they can't take it away from me. And I saw this all over my research. shoulders people through really hard times. So I remember even for myself, I wrote a chapter of Unicorn Space actually, and Anna kicks me in the eye. So I have this like giant black eye that night, and I had written a chapter that morning. And I remember thinking, wow, I'm so glad I wrote a chapter of this book on this day that Anna kicked me in the eye, because it really did make me able to handle the kick in the eye, physically and literally, but actually a lot of us get that metaphorically
right.
a lot easier. And the hard part is why we have to push back, why the book I wrote was not just a program to finding unicorn space through these curiosity, connection, completion avenues, but really had to address why we don't find it typically. It's actually not, I didn't really hear so much, well, I have no time. And then when I push back on it, it stay there, Lee. When people said I have no time and I push back, typically it broke down into, I don't believe I deserve the time, or I feel guilt and shame when I use that time, or I don't have a voice, or I'm not used to using my voice to ask for what I need.
Yeah.
So it's actually a little bit more complicated than I just don't have the time. And that's why I had to break down those 3 hurdles. The 3 hurdles aren't, I don't have time. It's really, how are you thinking about your time? Is that availability part of your identity to everybody else? Is it that there's guilt and shame that ruin these activities, so you don't want to do them in the first place? Or is it that I really don't even know where to start because I've never asked for what I need or know what I need?
I mean, it's really practicing in kind of claiming your power over your own existence. Yeah. And I think for a lot of our listeners who may be in law school, they may not be kind of at this phase of life where they might not, and probably not as many of our listeners have children yet, but I wish that I had been practicing this before I was partnered, when I was just even in law school, because I remember the feeling of being in law school of, I am so overwhelmed. Law school is the only thing that I can do. If I go to a yoga class, that's like a great pat on the head for my self-care. But I feel like that there was this idea that you give up everything, you sacrifice everything to do this one pursuit. And I wish that I had not treated it that way, because then I think I may have had some unicorn spaces that I could have gone back to as my life continued to get more complicated.
Absolutely. And actually surgeons do a pretty good job of this because they're men and they're used to, claiming their own time. I saw a lot of surgeons in my research who maintain a music practice during their residency, which I thought was really interesting. So I wonder what I don't have extra research in that. Someone should pick up that research, but there's definitely a correlation between surgeons and people who play music, whether it's rock bands or classical music. And I think you can think of yourself as the most busy in law school, and then you get your law firm and you realize your life is going to be more busy. And then you are in a law practice, and then you have children on top of that.
Right.
And you're just more busy. And then you have children's an aging parent, and then you're diagnosed with cancer. And then you have more on top of that. So it doesn't get easier over time, as we said, to reclaim our time. But if we all believe that we deserve to be more than our roles, that in law school, you're training to be a professional, that's a role. And the other roles that will be afforded to you over time are being a parent and a partner. That's really all society wants for you, that you should be a parent, a partner, and a professional. Then what you're doing is subversive. So you know why it's hard.
Right.
Because if you want to maintain a singing practice, if you want to maintain your improv practice, the irony is that these outside pursuits actually make you more productive. And we know that because there's all of this research into diffuse thinking, how important it is. It's like why we get our best ideas in the shower. A lot of people get their best ideas in their unicorn space pursuit, whether it's rowing across the Pacific Ocean, as one woman told me she's doing, or this one woman who's part of the Polar Bear Club. She got one of her great ideas sort of jumping into the Atlantic Ocean, whether it's in your pottery class, whether it's, again, in your improv group. But these pursuits are actually helpful to our productivity, because in those diffuse thinking moments, when we're not so task oriented, that's often when we come up with our best ideas.
And I think it's so easy to let this kind of cultural narrative just make you walk away, thinking it's the responsible thing to do. I remember being in my early 20s, I used to sing and do musicals, and I got a consulting job with a big fancy consulting firm. And I was finishing a run in a musical that I had been doing kind of at part-time community theater. And then I said, I now have to give this up because my job has become so important that I can't do this anymore. And everyone around me was like, that is true. You like, and it's,
your community theater days are done.
Right.
Yes.
You are now 23 and so important that you can't do community theater anymore. But I really think it's so easy to have it slip away when you're young, or at the beginning of your career, or professional life, because you feel like you have this infinite time. You feel like that, there's so much kind of runway left to do all of these things, but the years start going really fast.
100%. And also you start when you're in the demographic of early career, that's actually the most burned out segment of our workforce now, because at least parents like us can say we have to leave at 5 to go pick up our kid from daycare, right? We have another role to fall back into. But people in the workplace who in their younger part of their career really don't have parent or partner yet. So they just have professional.
Yeah.
And it's a lot harder. This one woman, Keisha, I talk about her, she really wanted to have a mixology practice in her life. And yes, she ended up using it back. It wasn't exactly fully untainted because she used it to teach her, the rest of her group in her workplace how to make drinks. But she did muster up the courage based on my coaching, because she was somebody I was interviewing for my book. But I sort of asked her to try to push back on leaving early on Thursdays, to virtually take this, virtually leaving early because that's whatever, to take this online mixology class. It's easier to say, I have to go pick up my kid from daycare. Harder for that segment of the workforce to say, I need to go, watch Netflix. I want to leave. So it becomes that part of the workforce becomes so much more, the single younger part of the workforce becomes a lot more burned out.
Yes. And I remember my friends, especially in management during COVID, who were not in a partnership, were not parents. And some of them saying, well, I'm working 80, 90-hour weeks because my team has children and I'm doing their work too. And that isn't a way.
It's not fair.
No, it's not fair. And it's not good for their health and well-being. That doesn't work for them either.
And the legal profession is not set up. It's actually set up to discriminate against you, because there's a legitimate path to 2 different types of careers. There's an of-counsel career in law firms, and there's a partner career in law firms. And so if you go to one of these big firms, the people that already take off or who are seen as less serious get on this of-counsel track if they're lucky. And that's already seen as a demotion to partnership.
Right.
So basically you're told from the beginning that only by working, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, will you get to this elusive thing called partner. And that's supposedly a good thing. But it's really, as one person said about being a partner in a law firm, right? It's like winning the pie eating contest and then just the prize is more pie.
That's a very good perspective. Well, in the few minutes we have left, I wanted to do a shout out to the Fair Play documentary, which I watched last night. I thought there were many interesting points in the documentary that maybe you had in the book, but it's been a few years since I read the book. The one that I really wanted to call out was about how in World War II, when they called women to the workforce, because the men were off at war, that they instituted childcare. Workplace childcare. I think it was the stat $1 billion a day. Was it a day?
Yes. It was
insane.
Either a day or a month. But it was the craziest statistic I'd ever heard.
Yes. And I think one of the things that really struck me about that was it's like we have cultural amnesia. Mm-hmm. We really, we are talking about these ideas like they are new or something that we should have to fight for, which we do have to fight for them. We need to fight for access to support. But it's like we, on some level, knew it not,
yes.
like
100 years
not
ago.
100 and that we're still having to fight these same fights. I thought that was very fascinating. I thought there were a number of fascinating points in the documentary, but that one really stuck with me.
Well, Leah, same shit, different decade. That's what I keep saying. And I think ironically, there's a lot of people out there who don't want us to know our history because of exactly what you just said. Cultural amnesia is a really good thing to keep power centers centered where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And when women are stepping up to want more power, we need different systems and we need societies designed in different ways. And it's very threatening. So we might as well strip women of their identity, tell them they have to always be available to their children and work in the workplace, because then they really will burn out and they won't know that owning a unicorn space, reclaiming their own time is actually subversive. It's actually part of the cultural movement to reclaim women's time the same way that childcare would.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're doing by pursuing a unicorn space, again, whether it's a knitting circle or, leading a hike, as we talked about, baking a pie and sharing it with a neighbor, you may think that these things are optional, but actually, if we haven't convinced you yet to take them up, you are being subversive and you're helping a cultural movement.
Why did you think that it was important to take the fair play message and put it in a documentary? What did you think was kind of special about that versus the book?
Well, I think it's just a different entry point, Lee. As you know, not many people read anymore or have the attention span, aka dopamine nation,
right?
To sit through, maybe a 300-page book. But the beauty of a documentary is that I think seeing people of all cultural persuasions struggling with the same problems, these small details becoming big issues, that, oh, wow, it's not just me and Seth fighting over him putting the garbage liner back in.
Mm-hmm.
These are actually structural design of our country that made it hard for us to be parents in this country. I think normalizing that we're not alone, even if it doesn't fix the problem, even though the documentary does point to solutions, even if it doesn't fix the problem, at least it normalizes the problem. And part of normalizing the problem is getting it out of the shadows and into the light. And I really do think visibility is value. And that's really what the fair play movement is about. It's making this invisible work visible. And I think a documentary is a great vehicle to do that.
I also appreciated that I thought you and your husband, Seth, were very vulnerable and honest about how it can be messy at times doing this work. And I thought the other couples that were on the documentary, and I think I appreciate the honesty of the way that it was presented, because I think we have to own that this stuff is messy, right? Especially when you're dealing with cultural norms and people feeling like we're all battling for time and just the stresses of daily life. So I appreciated the vulnerability. And I really loved this story about the jacket and was it the beer bottle on your lawn?
Yes.
About your husband walking by it for an entire day and not
whole
picking
day.
it up.
Yeah.
Whole
16
day.
hours of asking me to do something. And I didn't realize he was asking me to do something. And I think what we see in these stories is that at the end of the day, we've been living, for as sophisticated as a culture as we are, we've been living under this culture of very, very basic assumptions. Or as one woman said to me, her partner before fair play thought she had a magical vagina that whispered in her ear what his mother wanted for Christmas. So I think these very basic assumptions, if we can use some humor and tell people they're not alone, at least we're starting to break over in a conversation that we all need to have.
And I think you are creating community, which is, I think, a very powerful thing, to not only give women and really anyone who's living some language about this, but it's a powerful community movement that you've built. And I'm very happy to be part of this small part of it.
You're the best. You're the best. And I know I have to jump at one because my phone keeps ringing because I have, I'm going on air actually at one.
Well, you got it. Yeah.
Big hugs to you. I love being with you because you ask such important questions. And I love that you're normalizing this. And I could be your ghost of Christmas future, as we said, to an audience that hopefully will do things differently than the way we do them.
All right. Well, wonderful, Eve. Thank you for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
All right.
Truly
Big hugs. All right.
Big
Talk
hugs.
to you later.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye.
Bye.
If you want to learn more about Eve and her work, you can check out everodsky.com or fairplaylife.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.